Well, I'm not preaching on Martin Luther King Jr. today, but I do want to say a word. I've been reading his stuff again. Sometimes you'll get to hear a part of his speech. I think that when we look back at the words of Martin Luther King Jr., he had such a remarkable ability to challenge us about justice and humanity and love, and to choose just the right words, which challenge us and unite us at the same time. And so I hope that you will be thinking about him and his mission and his ministry and his words during this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and the way in which we can learn from him about how we choose our behaviors and our words in such a way that we move ever closer to not only justice but also to unity. This is the second in a series of sermons that I am doing on young Jesus. If you stop and think about it, most of what we have in terms of biblical material is found in 30 verses in the second half of the second chapter of Luke. We have 3 or 4 stories there that are remarkable that we never ever read. For the most part, we don't read or preach on them very much. And so we're going to spend today and the next 2 weeks kind of finding out what these stories tell us about who Jesus was. So today we're going to start, I think we may skip a little bit here if we can get it up there. There we go. Let me just say, after 8 days passed, it was time to circumcise the child, and he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. So we see that Mary and Joseph took him immediately to the temple, 8 days, to be circumcised and blessed. Then let's go up there to let's skip down some. Let's skip down to the story of Simeon. There we go. I wanted you to go home and read the whole chapter, but we're going to start here with verse 25. Now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. This man was righteous and devout, looking forward to the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit rested on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Guided by the Spirit, Simeon came into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what was customary under the law, Simeon took him in his arms. Get this picture, this old man took him in his arms and held him and praised God, saying, "Master, now you are dismissing your servant in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel." And the child's father and mother were amazed at what was being said about him. And we'll finish on that one. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A number of years ago, I read a story about a man in Cleveland, Ohio. This was actually at an American Legion convention. A man jumped up in the back of the auditorium at an American Legion convention in the middle of the program, ran down the aisle, took center stage, grabbed a microphone, and started shouting, "Does anybody know who I am? Is there anybody here who knows who I am?" Turns out that he had been wandering the streets of Cleveland for a couple of days. He had had some kind of accident or trauma. He didn't know what it was because he didn't remember it. He was suffering from amnesia. He had been to the emergency room. They had discharged him. They said, "You're healthy. We can't treat your amnesia." He was desperate to know who he was, so he jumps up on the stage in front of all of these strangers, crying out, "Does anybody know who I am?" I never really thought about it until I read that story, and I thought how painful it would be to not know your identity, to not know who you are, for there to be no relatives or friends, for you to have no memory of history, for you to have no relationships, for the simple reason that you have no sense of who you are, of identity. Our identity, who we claim ourselves to be, is extraordinarily important. So let me just say to you, when you go to lunch today and you say, "Now what was he talking about today?" This is a story about identity. First of all, the identity of Jesus, but secondly, our identity, who you and I are in the eyes of God. And so when we look at this story, young Jesus, 8 days old, the first thing the parents do is that they take him to the temple. And we set this up last week. We talked about the commitment that Mary and Joseph made to live a disciplined life based upon what they believe. They were going to practice what they believe as guided by the traditions of their faith community. They could have easily said, we don't need the temple, we don't need the church, we don't need the support. The angels have visited us. We know who this child is. We know who we are. We've had an ecstatic experience. They could have said, in today's lingo, they could have said, it's easy for us to be spiritual but not religious. Not Joseph and Mary. 8 days, they take him to the temple to be blessed and named and circumcised. I was driving around this morning. I was thinking about taking a child to church 8 days old. I don't know that there's any pediatrician that would recommend that these days. They say, look, we know you want to get your child baptized, get her named, all of that. But let's wait a few weeks at least, a few months, let the immunity build and all of that. And my good friend, Dr. Pat Gum, came to mind. Many of you remember Trey and Pat Gum. They would sit right down here. They have moved down to Dallas. They're no longer near us. But she was a brilliant cardiologist. Brilliant. She was trained at the Cleveland Clinic. And when her third daughter was born on Tuesday, the next Sunday, I was holding that child in my hands. The baby was born on Tuesday. The following Sunday, we baptized her. Pat couldn't wait to get to the church, get that baby in my hand so we could say, this one belongs to God. And that's exactly what's taking place in this story. We see it in the story of Simeon. There's a story about Anna, the prophetess, that follows this. We didn't read it in this particular service. But what Simeon does is he raises this child in the midst of the congregation. And he says, this one belongs to God. This one is not only a child of God, but this one is the Messiah. Now I am able to go to my death and rest in peace because my eyes have seen the Messiah. It's an extraordinary moment in the beginning of the second chapter where the identity of Jesus is fully revealed to the congregation and to the people, even to Gentiles, to Jews and Gentiles. If you read it carefully, to Jews and Gentiles, this one is a child of God, and this one is the Messiah. I don't know about you, but when I started reading through this and thinking about it, I thought, this is what we do in the life of the church, isn't it? To use the Jewish term, this is who we are and what we do in the temple. In some ways, this is the most fundamental mission that we claim in the life of the church, and that is we tell people who they are. I think about all the things we do in this church. And we pass the offering plates, and you pile the offering plates full of money because you believe in them. Project Hope and Project Next Generation, the intervention in the lives of these children who are at risk and families that come together and start succeeding because of the intervention of the church and people who care about them and love them. I think about School on Sunday. They'll be up there today. These children learning how to be successful in school when just a year ago they were failing in every way possible, academically, socially. All of those things are so important, but really it begins with this fundamental proclamation about who we are as the children of God. And these baptisms we did a moment ago, I've lost track of how many children I've baptized through the years, but someplace around 1,500, I'm guessing. And every one of them has been important. I would say that every one of them has been as important as that moment with Jesus. Because in every case, we remind the parents, we remind the congregation, this child is a child of God. And honestly, I don't know that it's ever been more important in terms of the world in which we live. Because you see, the world provides a lot of messages that aren't consistent with that. I mean, you send your kid out into the world these days, and they're going to hear a lot of names that you're not going to want them to hear. She's a loser. He didn't make the grade. I think about our teenagers, about our Living Proof Youth Choir. They sing at the early service. The advertising and the marketing that we do in today's world. If you can't make it into this college, you're just not going to be able to make it. If you're not able to drive a car like this, you're not worthy. If you're not able to meet the standards of this group, you're just not in. You know, I played sports when I was young. I'm a competitive person. I love sports. And so I get that idea, you know, when the Olympics comes around and somebody says, you know, I'm really competitive. If I come in second, that doesn't mean I've come in second. That means I'm the first loser. I understand where that comes from, but I think about what the message is to our children when we say, if you're not number one, you're a loser. And it is the temple, it's the church that stands in the midst of a competitive world like that and says, look, it doesn't make any difference who you are, how you came into this world. It doesn't make any difference who your family is or how much money you have or what you do for a living. Every child is a child of God. Every person is a child of God. It's the most fundamental proclamation that we have as the church and as followers of Jesus. The world does not give us our identity. God gives us our identity. I was 19 or 20 years old when I met my first drug addict. I was working in the psychology department of the Wichita Falls State Mental Hospital. I was doing an intake on a young man, and all of a sudden he was sitting across from me. He was my age, almost exactly my age. And I looked at his arms. There were tracks. He'd been mainlining heroin. I don't know, maybe I grew up, had a sheltered life until the time I was 20, but I'd never seen that before. And he and I started talking. He told me his story. I'll tell you his story sometime. I'm not going to tell you his story today, but I'll just say to you that that was my first encounter with true hard drug addiction, but not my last. Since that day, in one way or the other, I've been involved. You see, the opioid epidemic that we have now was preceded by the black tar heroin epidemic that we had a few years ago. Children in this community and in this church were taken by it. And before that, there was speed, methamphetamines. And then back in the early 80s, the late 70s and early 80s, some of you don't really remember this, there was this tremendous surge, this epidemic of addiction with heroin, especially cocaine, crack cocaine, especially in the inner cities. A lot of us we thought we could just look the other way and ignore that because it was in the inner cities. You know, there are all these street names for illegal drugs. Heroin and cocaine especially. Cocaine is called coke. Sugar, smack. Heroin, H, horse. Junk. And I remember back in the 80s, there was a kind of subterranean advertising campaign by the drug dealers that played off the tagline. It was for cocaine. It played off the tagline of Coca-Cola. There were actually banners that were printed and put up in tenement houses in certain parts of our inner cities in America. It said this: things go better with Coke. Things go better with cocaine. And a dealer would use it. He'd be haggling over the price of a drug, and he'd say, look, man, things go better with Coke. That became the gospel for a lot of people. And then I remember a countercultural campaign that was started in the inner city by some people from the church. I think it was in Chicago. If you Google this phrase, you're not going to find the origin of it, but here's the origin of this phrase. I know I'm somebody because God don't make no junk, heroin junk. You can Google it. There's songs now. There are people who have preached about it. People have written about it. But that's where it started. It started in the inner city. People from the church went down into the tenement houses, and they saw babies that were being born into this world addicted to cocaine and heroin. And somebody came up with this phrase, a phrase that those young children could understand. They got it. It was the language of the street. They started printing banners that said, I know I'm somebody because God don't make no junk. I mean, it's important, isn't it? These children we just baptized, it's important for them to grow up knowing that there's somebody because God doesn't make junk. It's important for them to know, I'm somebody because I'm a child of God, and God's work is always good. It's important for them to grow up, and while they're being rejected by colleges and rejected by social groups and rejected from firms that they want to work for, they know they've not been rejected by the church. They know they belong to God. In December of 2006, maybe 2007, right around that time, I remember this because it was right before Christmas, about December the 20th. I received an invitation to go to Washington, D.C. to be a part of a group that started the Methodist commitment to nothing but net. Some of you may remember Rick O'Reilly started this campaign. Children's lives were being saved by simply donating $1, buying a net in Africa. Children who were dying from malaria, millions of lives were saved. And the Methodist Church was one of the original partners of this. When my time is up and this is on my resume, I'll be pleased about it. I don't know why they invited me, but I got on a plane. I went to Washington December 20th and 21st, I think it was. I remember it was a busy time. I had to make room for it on my schedule. We went up to the National Press Club, the famed press club. I remember going up there and walking in. There were a handful of bishops in the room and 3 or 4 pastors. And there were representatives from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and representatives from the United Nations Foundation. And over 2 days, we hammered out the strategy for how United Methodists would partner with Nothing But Nets. It was a remarkable venture, and over the next few years, United Methodist literally raised millions and millions, in excess of $50 million, to buy bed nets to save children from malaria in Africa. But one night, I think it was that first night maybe, a group of us were walking to dinner, to a nice restaurant to dinner, and I remember exactly where this conversation took place because we were literally walking by the White House. And I was walking alongside Larry Holland. Larry Holland was what we called our General Secretary of United Methodist Communications, our national communications agency. In Methodism, General Secretary means CEO. So he's the CEO. He was one of the people who came up with this idea of partnering as Methodists with Nothing But Nets. And I'd known Larry and respected him. We'd been friends for a number of years, but we'd always just been working together, doing work. And we were walking past the White House, and I turned to him and I said, Larry, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? And he said, well, Don, believe it or not, I actually grew up in Texas. I said, really? No kidding. I said, what town? He said, West Texas. I said, what town in West Texas? He said, you name it. I was in all the towns: Shamrock, Borger, Pampa, Muleshoe. I lived in most of those little towns in West Texas. I said, oh, well, your father must have been in the oil business, right? He said, yep. I'm always curious. I always ask questions. I said, well, what was he? Was he a geologist or a petroleum engineer? He said, nope. He was just a plain old roughneck. And, I always say this. Everybody has their story. If you'll give them a chance, they'll tell you their story. And so I just listened, and he told me his story. He said, the way I grew up, he said, my father's just a roughneck. Neither my mother or father ever even finished high school. They weren't educated. My father drank too much. And he would drink and he'd lose his job, and we'd move to another little town and he'd get a job, and we just moved around. That's the way we lived. And he launched into this story about waiting for the school bus. He said, I was in a town one time. He said, I don't even remember which one of those towns I was in, but I was standing with a group of children early one morning waiting for the school bus. And a group of older boys came up and stood behind us. And one of them tapped me on the shoulder and he said, hey, you. He said, you go over there and stand on that corner over there. He said he was older than I was and bigger than I was. I didn't know anything else to do, so I did. I went over there and I stood on the corner. He said, when I got there, one of the other boys that was with him pointed at me and he said, look at him. He ain't nothing but white trash. And the boy who'd sent me over there said, oh no, you're wrong about that. He ain't that good. He ain't nothing but oil field trash. He said, that's the way I grew up. He said one day in one of those towns, the father of one of my schoolmates invited me to church on a Sunday night. He said, I really didn't even know what a church was. He said, my mother and father didn't even own a Bible. I'd never even seen a Bible. All I know is that this father was nice, and his son had kind of been nice to me. And the father said, why don't you come to our church tonight? And I did. I went. And he said, all I remember about that first night was that they had a pool table. And the father taught me how to shoot pool, and that they were nice to me. The next week, they invited me back, and I went back the next week. And the next week, one night, we had a wiener roast. That's all I remember at first. We would shoot pool, we'd have a wiener roast, and they were kind to me. But I went back over and over again. I started going on Sunday morning and going to Sunday school. Somebody gave me a Bible. I started reading the Bible, and one day, I came to the conclusion that I wasn't oil field trash, but that I was a child of God. He said, I walked down the aisle by myself. I just did it. I got up, I walked down the aisle, I joined the church, I gave my life to Christ. He's a layman. He's not a pastor. He said, that's how I got here. That's the way I grew up. And that's why I'm here. Because it was the church who taught me that I'm okay, that my life is worthy, that I'm a child of God. Look, I don't know what you make of this passage from the 2nd chapter of Luke. This extraordinary story about these angels come and visit Mary and Joseph individually. They say, look, you're going to have a baby. He's going to grow up. He'll be a child of God, but he'll be more than that. He'll be the Messiah. And then as soon as this child is born, they put a diaper on him and maybe a little baptismal gown. I don't know. They take him to the church to be dedicated to God. Old Simeon stands up and holds this child. This one belongs to God. I don't know what you make of it other than somehow Mary and Joseph decided that the temple was important, that it was important for the congregation to gather around their child Jesus and to hold him and love him and tell him You belong to God. And if you'll keep reading, you'll see that the child grew into a boy who grew into a man who walked through the small towns of the Middle East. And every person he met, Gentile, Jew, young or old, male or female, every person he met, he greeted them and treated them as a child of God. Larry Holland, a number of years ago, Larry Holland was the chief executive at the communications agency of the Methodist Church. He was the one who created the tagline for United Methodists: open minds, open hearts, open doors. That was Larry Holland. And you know, to this day, I meet people. Sometimes I meet other United Methodists who say, open hearts, open minds, open doors. What does that mean? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. That means as United Methodists, we don't have any standards at all. We have no doctrinal standards. Open hearts, open minds, open hearts, open doors. That means just anybody could join the Methodist Church. And I always say, yep, anybody can join the Methodist Church. Thanks be to God.